because the Doctor doesn't need visuals to tell a story. So this is going to be my first ever review of a Big Finish audio drama about Doctor Who. This is not really my first encounter with Doctor Who audio because I have Dead Air, which is a little bit different because it's not a full cast drama. It's just David Tennant doing the whole thing by himself, and it's a bit more like an audiobook in that way. But I have gotten and now listened to Shada. And as I said, this is my first time encountering Big Finish and the way that they handle Doctor Who audio. Short version, I am quite happy. So I'll keep this as spoiler-free as I can. If I drop one or two, I apologize. So there are a lot of Big Finish audios out there. Why did I pick this particular one? The answer is quite simple. Long before I knew Doctor Who, before I even really knew who Doctor Who was, I loved Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Douglas Adams, still one of my favorite writers ever. And actually, in a way, he was one of my initial hooks into classic Doctor Who. After I had gotten into new Doctor Who and I wanted to go back to the old stuff, the first stuff I watched was stuff that I knew he had worked on, either as the writer or as the story editor. So Douglas Adams and Doctor Who, to me, in my mind, already kind of linked in a lot of ways. So this was a story that he wrote back in the 70s. If you don't know the background on this, this was actually scripted to be filmed with Tom Baker. And they even started shooting it, but production got shut down because they were trying to get it done at a time when there was a labor dispute with some of the unions working at the BBC, and the whole thing just kind of fell apart and they weren't ever able to go back and finish it. Some of the footage did get used in The Five Doctors, basically just to try and explain why the Fourth Doctor wasn't in the entire rest of that, and oddly enough, they actually kind of addressed that in this too. But for the most part, this is minimally changed from Douglas Adams' original script, so far as I understand it. I mean, there's some changes to make sure that the story is told completely through audio and you can get by on just the sound. But really the only notable change is the fact that they turned it into an Eighth Doctor story instead of a Fourth Doctor story. That means we have Paul McGann as the Doctor, which I was very happy to hear because I have said that I think Paul McGann is a great Doctor, but because I've only been watching the show so far, that means I was stuck with the movie, which he is great in, but is not good, and The Night of the Doctor, which is wonderful, but is incredibly short. So now I finally got to spend some time with Paul McGann's Doctor in a good story, and I was quite happy to do so. I don't know where I'm going to go from here in terms of Big Finish stuff, but knowing that this is the best way to get an Eighth Doctor fix, I have a feeling a lot of my early purchases are probably going to be Eighth Doctor material. But in terms of story, so the Doctor goes to Cambridge with Romana 2, Lalla Ward, and K9 in tow in order to see a professor, just sort of sensing he needs to see him, and there's something that has to be dealt with here. And then, of course, craziness ensues. The fact that I know Douglas Adams' work means that a lot of this rang very familiar, partly because Douglas Adams tends to deal with a lot of similar tropes, and also partially because a character was reused wholesale from this script. The character of Professor Chronotis, the Cambridge professor, actually appears virtually unchanged in Douglas Adams' novel, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. So it was funny, it was a character that I felt like I already knew. Thankfully, his use and what he does in this is different enough that I didn't totally know what was going to happen, but for me that actually enhanced the experience a little bit. There are a number of other people thrown in there as well, but the one I want to highlight in terms of the supporting cast is Sean Biggerstaff playing a character called Chris, who's basically functioning as the add-on companion for just this story and this adventure, and he is wonderful. I mean, he's just awesome. He's exactly what I love out of a companion, because there's stuff going on he has no idea, he's way out of his depth, but when something happens that he doesn't understand, he just kind of goes, oh, okay. And that's the kind of response to the reaction that I always love from a companion, and he's great. And some people, I mean, if you're a Harry Potter fan, you know Sean Biggerstaff as Oliver Wood from the early Harry Potter movies, and he's great. He was so good, in fact, that I looked up whether they actually ever used him again as a more ongoing companion for Eighth Doctor Audio Adventures, and sadly they don't. I kind of wish they did. It feels like a waste. He was really good, and he's got great rapport with McGann. In terms of the rest of the supporting cast, Lalla Ward is fine. John Leeson comes back as K9, and he's good, Yeah, but I mean, Canine can get old. Thankfully, I think they got the right dosage of him in this one, so he works just fine. Professor Chronotis, like I said, felt familiar, felt almost like slipping into an old sweater, just getting that character again, who I already knew. If there's a fall down on this thing, it's a couple of things. The big one, though, is the villain. Now, the villain, in terms of their scheme, it's kind of generic, but it comes down more, I think, to both the writing and the performance, because one of the downsides of adapting Douglas Adams' script from the 1970s is that this feels like a very 70s era Doctor Who story, particularly when it comes to the villain, which is just, he's a very arch villain. He's very, I have you now, Doctor! Ha 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 ha! And which was kind of the bog standard one-off villain from that era of Doctor Who, and that's exactly what we get here. And it's generic, and it's kind of campy, and it's over the top, and it's one of those things that works better when you're watching it because you get the slightly campy visuals as well, and it sells it better. But when it's an audio and your brain may or may not be coming up with campy visuals, you may be envisioning something more grounded or whatever, and then this hammy performance just it doesn't work. I think it's debatable whether it would have worked at all, but in this context, in an audio medium, it has a lesser chance of working for you, and for me, it didn't really work. Thankfully, his scheme and what he's doing is interesting enough that he doesn't totally fall down, but he's certainly not the draw of this thing. I mean, the draw of this thing is the Doctor, his interaction, and the humor. There is a lot of humor in this, as one would expect from anything Douglas Adams does. Humor was kind of really his forte, in addition to, the sci-fi concepts he was dealing with. So overall, I really did enjoy Shada. The thing that you do need to keep in mind is that it was written for the 70s. Now, I think they've adapted it very well for the Eighth Doctor in terms of, from what I understand of Paul McGann as the Eighth Doctor, which again is limited, but it all seems to fit. It doesn't seem like he's reading lines that were meant for the Fourth Doctor. I don't know if they goosed them or if he's just that good at making the lines his own. So that works just fine, but the overall feel of the thing is very 70s. And if that era of Doctor Who isn't so much your thing, maybe approach this one with a little caution. I mean, they embrace the 70s thing. I mean, they even use that 70s era music, and in fact, they insert the outros and the intro music at each point, which would have been an episode break had this actually been filmed as scripted and gone to air, which I thought was kind of a neat touch, but again, just emphasizes how kind of dated the material is in a way. But overall, this was great, and I had a very positive first experience with this being my first Big Finish Doctor Who story. So, Shada, have you ever heard it? What do you think of it? If you haven't, what Big Finish stories would you recommend I look into checking out? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, ring that bell down there so you get notifications when I put new stuff up. Follow me on Twitter at Council of Geeks. Give a listen to the Council of Geeks podcast. My God, this outro is getting lengthy. I gotta trim some of this down, but until I do, this council is adjourned.